Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge.
The air inside that prison meeting room, heavy. And I don't just mean the smell of disinfectant clinging to the walls or the annoying flicker of the fluorescent lights above. No, this heaviness was something else. It pressed down on the skin, made every breath feel stolen, and whispered a cruel reminder. Inside these walls, you belong to someone else. Every second of your life isn't yours anymore. And there he was, Sean Diddy Combs. Once the mogul who ruled music, fashion, and nightlife with an iron grip and a golden smile, now just another man behind cold steel bars. But what made this day different was the way he sat across from his lawyer, his body stiff, his stare locked, not with arrogance, not with casual charm, but with a seriousness that sent chills straight down the spine. This wasn't going to be the usual meeting about appeals or motions. Number Diddy had come with something urgent, something terrifying, something that made even his lawyer's pen tremble before touching paper.
Combs be released from jail? I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. Circumstances have changed, and I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. I think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations. That's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard, and they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons.
He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper, as if the cracked paint on the walls had ears, as if the shadows themselves were listening. And then, piece by piece, the nightmares spilled out. The nights, he confessed, had turned into his worst enemy. Darkness wasn't about rest anymore. It was about movement, about shadows that seemed to breathe, shift, and hover just beyond sight. The silence of the corridors wasn't comforting, it was threatening. Sometimes it was broken by faint scrapes across the floor, muffled laughter echoing at 3 a.m., or footsteps that stopped just outside his cell, before vanishing into nothing. And then came the notes. tiny folded pieces of paper slipped inside his cell as if ghosts were delivering them. Each one short, chilling, and impossible to ignore. One read, "We know who you talk to." Another, even worse, "You can't run from here." The words weren't just threats, they were reminders. Reminders that in prison, power doesn't wear a uniform. It moves in silence, hides in shadows, and strikes when you least expect it. But what truly broke the illusion of safety was when Diddy admitted it wasn't just the inmates. Guards, the very people meant to protect, were acting strange. Some appeared in places they had no reason to be. Security cameras went down for no clear reason. Doors stayed unlocked just a little too long. Guards turned their backs exactly when they shouldn't have. Coincidence? Please. It was too perfect, too coordinated. And then, the revelation that made his lawyer's hand clench the pen tighter. This prison wasn't just running on drugs, gangs, or violence. It was running on something far more dangerous: information.
And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, "There has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arrange for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend as part of a demonstrated swingers lifestyle and has been prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act. Combs and two of his longtime girlfriends had a private, intimate life that is not uncommon today." They're talking about Jane and Cassie Ventura. Quote, "It may not have been common on June 25th, 1910, when the Mann Act, or as it was originally called, the White Slave Traffic Act, was passed, but attitudes about sex and morality have come a long way in the last 115 years. It is worth noting that when the Mann Act was passed to protect the morals and decency of America's women were not allowed to vote. As noted below, perhaps due to the troubling background of this statute, whose history is rich with both racism and misogyny, the Department of Justice has limited its application to those people profiting financially from the business of prostitution and not using it to prosecute consensual adults for their own lifestyles." By the way, we covered this on a previous sidebar. The defense made an argument months ago to have these charges thrown out, called it basically racially motivated, that it was strange that it was being used against a successful black man. That argument didn't work. He was ultimately prosecuted and he was convicted on those charges. Cassie Ventura and Sean Combs went to swingers clubs and they had threesomes. Miss Ventura consistently expressed interest and enthusiasm in her intimate life with Combs, including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted two different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, "missed Paul." When asked why she said that, she responded, "Because I did." This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were: serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used.
In that prison, information wasn't just power, it was currency. Forget smuggled drugs or hidden blades. What people were really trading was lives, your background, your weaknesses, your secrets, your case files. And for someone like Diddy, that information was worth more than gold. Every whisper about him, every rumor, every slip of paper, they weren't just random threats. They were part of a bigger game, a system where his name wasn't just a celebrity headline, it was leverage. People were treating his very existence like chips on a poker table. One inmate passing him in the hallway didn't need to shout or throw a punch. Instead, he leaned in, whispered a single phrase, and walked away as if nothing had happened. "You're marked." That was it. No yelling, no scene, just a calm, terrifying truth dropped like a bomb. Because in prison, when someone tells you you're marked, you don't need an explanation. You already know what it means. And then came the bigger fear. It wasn't just the inmates circling like sharks. Some guards seemed to be in on it. Cameras conveniently failing. Locked doors suddenly left ajar. Security vanishing at the exact moment eyes should have been watching. This wasn't incompetence. This was orchestration. Diddy's lawyer scribbled furiously, underlining phrases, circling dates, connecting timelines. What started as a conversation quickly turned into a legal dossier, something far darker than paranoia. This wasn't just a bad dream. It was evidence. Real threats, real negligence, and very real danger.
These women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts, and obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending.
By the end of the meeting, the urgency had reached a breaking point. His lawyer didn't even wait. The second the meeting ended, the phone was in hand. A quick, sharp call to his office. Within hours, an emergency motion was drafted, reviewed, and prepared for filing. It accused the prison of gross negligence, spelling out the chilling series of threats and failures that had left Diddy's life hanging by a thread. The demand? Immediate transfer to a secure facility or the kind of extraordinary protection usually reserved for high-level informants. And when that motion hit the court, it didn't stay hidden for long. Parts were sealed, sure, but enough details slipped through to ignite a firestorm. The internet exploded. Social media lit up like wildfire. Twitter threads, TikTok breakdowns, Instagram reels, everyone had an opinion. Some whispered about gang politics, others pushed theories of outside hits, revenge plots, or even power struggles tied to people far beyond prison walls. Was this about street politics? Was it a message from rivals? Or was it something deeper, darker, tied to money and influence that stretched past the iron bars? Theories spread like smoke, and the world couldn't look away.
Stand and give his story, tell his story, give his version of events. Obviously, there are a ton of risks that come with putting a defendant on the stand, but it would be his choice. Was there a conversation about that?
Well, I mean, I can't get into, attorney-client privilege
Sure,
conversations. Obviously he thought about it, decided not to. And, as I indicated earlier, we thought the case had gone in really well for us. And so we liked where we were. So that was basically the decision.
Now, the big news, a lot of big news came out after the trial, was the firing of Maureen Comey, the lead prosecutor in this case. Now, there's obviously a political angle to it. There are comments that she has made, but I have to ask, you going head to head against her for so many weeks, months and before that, the firing of her, what did you make of that?
I think it was unfortunate. She's a very well-respected prosecutor. We had good sort of professional relationships with her during the course of the trial. And, I don't really think it had anything to do with the trial, but I can't really say anything beyond that. It just,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's talk about something we can get into quite a bit. Let's talk bail. Okay, so we did a previous sidebar breaking down the defense's renewed motion for release, several arguments for why Sean Combs, should be released on bail pending sentencing, acquitted of the most serious charges. There's no comparable case of someone who is convicted of the Mann Act alone and not engaging in sex trafficking or a prostitution for financial gain, and they would be locked up like this. Talked about the issues plaguing the MDC, how it is dangerous, how he's not a risk of flight, not a danger to the community. But do you think Judge Arun Subramanian is going to be persuaded by your letter, by your motion? Because obviously he specifically highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent. Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. They had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off, and I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual.
Mainstream media couldn't resist. Former wardens, criminologists, ex-inmates, they all lined up for their airtime. Analysts debated whether Diddy was playing a card for sympathy or if this was a chilling reality. Some scoffed, calling it a trick to get special treatment, but others, the ones who knew prison life, they nodded grimly. "This isn't paranoia," one said. "It's the slow tightening of a noose." And while the public argued, the prison administration gave the most careful, lawyer-polished statement imaginable. They promised a thorough review and pledged to investigate. But notice what they didn't do? Deny. Not one single specific. Their silence said more than their words ever could. Meanwhile, inside those walls, Diddy's world shrank. Every step in the yard became a calculation. Every glance in the cafeteria carried risk. Every bite of food had to be taken with eyes scanning the room, watching who sat where. One wrong look, one wrong move, and it could be over.
Particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been in prison, or jail rather, for like 11 months. This case is a one-off to begin with, but we're not aware of any case like this with a Mann Act conviction where anyone's done that much time to begin with. So.
And prosecutors, I'm imagining, have come back or will come back and say, well, listen, look, after the raids on his property, he engaged, or what they will say, he allegedly engaged in criminal activity and obviously violence, they say, with Jane, but they say, look, what was in his hotel room when he was picked up in New York, made allegations of what he was trying to do while he was in the MDC, whether it was using other inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls. That was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago, but how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time, and I think one of the good things and positive things is that has come out of his incarceration. It's given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance, and he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that, and I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I think that you have to take each step at a time, and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission, and he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life.
Sleep, a luxury. He only managed it in bursts, always ready to snap awake at the faintest noise. The scrape of shoes outside his cell might have been nothing, or it might have been everything. His legal team refused to let the pressure die down. More motions were filed. Interviews were given. They shouted to the press that the danger was real, that every passing day without court action was a gamble with his life. And outside the prison, the case took on a life of its own. Advocacy groups spoke out. Celebrities cautiously weighed in. Petitions circulated demanding reform, demanding safety. For once, the debate wasn't just about Diddy the mogul, it was about the system itself. But for him, inside those walls, none of that mattered. Every whisper still carried closer. Every note became sharper, more direct. The lights went out and the darkness felt heavier. His words had placed him on record, but they'd also painted a target on his back.
The cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale.
Reality of surviving the next day. The threats hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown more pointed. The whispers were closer now. The notes more direct. And every time the lights went out, the dark seemed a little heavier. He had spoken, and that changed everything. It made him a problem for some, a cause for others, and a target for many. Whether the court acted or not, his words were in the record, a permanent warning of what might come. And in prison, that kind of truth could be both a shield and a weapon, but never without cost. The rest of the world could only watch, speculate, and wait for the next headline. Inside, Diddy could only prepare. The clock was ticking, and every second brought him closer to an outcome no one could yet see. But everyone could feel. Reporters rushed toward the exit the moment the session ended, racing each other to break the news first. Phones lit up. News alerts blared. Within minutes, headlines screamed across every major outlet. Judge hands down stunning sentence to Diddy. Mogul's fate sealed in final trial moments. The world didn't just hear about the verdict, they felt the shock of it. What happened next was almost as telling as the sentence itself. The music industry, which had been watching from a cautious distance, fell into a deep, calculated silence. Artists who once shared stages and champagne with Diddy suddenly had nothing to say. Executives who built deals with him behind closed doors were now staying behind closed doors.
Risk. And they go on to argue, though Mr. Combs has been a model inmate for his nearly year-long period of confinement, the violent conditions are still very much a concern for Mr. Combs and is an unnecessary confinement risk given the clear precedent of multiple similarly situated Mann Act convictions where defendants were released on conditions. Now, the government, by the way, would probably disagree with that statement of him being a model inmate. Remember when they accused Combs of trying to arrange three-way phone calls and buying the use of other inmates' phone privileges to try to make sure the government wasn't listening in, that he was having these private conversations, that he was allegedly trying to contact witnesses in the case, that he allegedly orchestrated a birthday campaign to help his public image while he was locked up. So if we hear a government response, I'm sure they're going to say something about that. Then, the defense highlights he's not a risk of flight, he's not a danger to the community, which, by the way, I think are real key points here. But they seem to echo a lot of the same arguments that they have already stated to the court. And remember, they haven't been successful in the past. That he voluntarily came to New York last year to surrender himself to authorities, that he gave up his passport to his attorneys 6 months before his arrest, paid off his mortgage on his Miami home so it was free and clear for him to stay at while out on bond. He was just acquitted of the most serious charges that he was facing, which, by the way, carried decades, if not life in prison. That he's not a risk of flight. That's the basic argument. Now, when it comes to the danger argument, that is key. Why? Judge Subramanian had said after the verdict that the reason he was denying bail was because of Combs' violence, that his own attorneys admitted he was violent during the course of the trial. Well, here is what Combs' defense attorneys argue about that. Quote, the court noted that the defense admitted a history of domestic violence as to Miss Ventura and that he struck Jane twice in June 2024. However, we strenuously object that Mr. Combs poses a danger to the community, aside from a single instance on June 18, 2024, where Mr. Combs was provoked by Jane through her own acts of violence. there was no evidence of any acts of violence in the last 7 years. Indeed, the jury notably rejected the government's argument that the June 2024 incident constituted coercion when it acquitted Mr. Combs of the sex trafficking charge. Also, prior to his arrest in this case, Mr. Combs enrolled in a domestic violence program in which he participated until he was arrested and incarcerated in connection with this case. If released on conditions, Sean Combs will not be violent to anyone. As we said in court, this jury gave him his life back, and he will not squander his second chance at life, nor would he do anything to further jeopardize his 7 children not having a father and 4 of his children not having a parent at all. The court can fashion any set of conditions, and Mr. Combs will abide by any condition to make the court comfortable that Mr. Combs will not be violent toward any person. And that is when they proposed the following bail package: that Combs will sign a $50 million bond secured by his home in Miami, that the bond will be co-signed by 3 financially responsible people, that Combs will reside in his home in Miami, that his travel will be limited to the Southern District of Florida, the Southern District of New York for attorney meetings, as well as airports that are necessary.
And then it happened. Reporters were already buzzing outside the courtroom, waiting for something big. But when the judge finally delivered the sentence, it wasn't just words on paper, it was a thunderclap. Phones lit up, headlines screamed, social media exploded within seconds. Judge hands down stunning sentence to Diddy. Mogul's fate sealed in final trial moments. The world didn't just read about it, they felt the shock ripple through their bones. And the silence that followed was deafening. Not inside the courtroom, no, inside the music industry. The same artists who had once danced beside him on stage, toasted champagne with him in lavish clubs, posted flashy Instagram stories with him, suddenly they had nothing to say. Executives who built fortunes off his name vanished behind closed doors, not because of loyalty, number because of survival. The message was loud and clear: stay away from Diddy. Don't let his shadow touch yours. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a signal, a warning, a line in the sand. The old rules, they were gone. For decades, the powerful, the rich, the untouchable had found ways to slip through the cracks, to bend the law, to twist justice, to keep their crowns polished while the rest of the world drowned. But not this time. This ruling wasn't about the number of years stamped on paper. It was about the symbolism, about stripping away the shield of celebrity and saying, you don't get your own version of justice because of who you are. You get this. And yet, whispers filled the air. Was this really the end? Or was this just the beginning of another game? Because history has shown us before, high-profile convictions often don't stay permanent. Backroom deals, obscure technicalities, appeals that drag on for years. They've saved powerful men before. And if anyone had the resources, the stubborn will, and the network of connections to claw his way back, it was Diddy. His team? Oh, they weren't going to sleep. They weren't going to sit quietly and accept this number. They were ready to challenge every clause, every ruling, every witness statement if they had to. But this wasn't the 2000s. The world had changed. Social media had stripped away patience for privilege. Millions of eyes were watching, dissecting, judging in real time. Every motion, every whisper of a deal would be exposed, debated, dragged under the harsh light of public opinion. That kind of scrutiny, it could make even the most powerful players hesitate. And yet, the harsh reality stood tall in front of Diddy. This wasn't a temporary break. This wasn't a retreat to reinvent. This was exile, pure and simple. The man who built his entire empire on the image of being unstoppable was about to learn what it truly meant to have no control at all. And maybe that's why the air felt so heavy. Because this wasn't just the end of a trial. This was the end of an era, the death of a myth. For years, we were sold the story that some people, especially the famous, especially the rich, could always find a way out, that the rules were different for them, that the crown was untouchable. But the judge's gavel didn't just close the case, it slammed shut an entire chapter of that fantasy.